You probably look at a quiet mother and see submission or weakness. You are entirely wrong. My silence was simply the deadly calm before a Category 5 hurricane, the exact moment an empire built in the shadows prepared to shatter the arrogant facades of the ungrateful. True revenge is never about screaming or throwing tantrums. It is a quiet game of chess where I strip all the oxygen from my enemy's room with a single signature. Hello to our wonderful listeners of James Revenge Stories. We are truly grateful for your continued support, but recently YouTube has demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep operating. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team to cover their living expenses and continue creating stories for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the description or comments of this video. My name is Kennedy Fox. I am 45 years old. Currently, I am standing in the corner of a ridiculously lavish hotel suite in Austin, Texas. The air conditioning hums a steady, freezing tune, chilling the sweat on the back of my neck. I hold a small needle between my fingers, carefully stitching a loose thread on the hem of my simple navy dress. I do not have a stylist. I do not have a makeup team hovering around me. Downstairs, my daughter Harper, who is 24 years old today, is preparing to marry into a world I am supposedly not a part of. To Harper, and certainly to her newly acquired in-laws, I am just an administrative worker, a loyal, unremarkable paper pusher at a corporate entity called Stratos Edge Dynamics. In their eyes, I am the quintessential struggling single mother. I am a woman who simply kept her head down, packed modest lunches, and ground away at a generic desk for decades just to keep the lights on and pay the monthly water bill. That is the narrative they constructed to make sense of my plain clothes and tired eyes. That is the narrative I allowed them to keep. The wedding reception is a sprawling, aggressive display of new wealth. Julian, the groom, is a golden boy from the freshly minted tech elite of Silicon Valley. His family is polished, relentlessly confident, and utterly suffocating. When I finally make my way down to the grand ballroom, the scent of expensive white orchids and imported champagne hits me like a physical wall. The lighting is meticulously dimmed, casting a warm golden hue over women draped in designer silk and men in sharply tailored tuxedos. Julian's parents greet me near the entrance with perfectly practiced smiles. They are polite. However, it is a terrifyingly precise kind of polite, the exact sort of courtesy reserved for charity cases or the hired help. They nod slowly, they ask a generic question about my commercial flight, and then they swiftly guide me away from the center of attention. My assigned seat is not near the bridal party. It is at a small, wobbly table pushed far into the darkest corner of the massive room. I am seated with a distant, socially awkward cousin who arrived late and an elderly neighbor no one knows what to do with. I am effectively hidden away with the disposable guests. I sit in silence. I watch the glittering crowd swirl around the dance floor. I watch my daughter. Harper looks stunning floating across the room in a customized lace gown that costs more than what I supposedly earn in an entire year. As she laughs, throwing her head back under the crystal chandelier, I catch a fleeting glimpse of her father in her smile. My ex-husband was a silver-tongued addict. He abandoned us when Harper was exactly 5 years old. He packed a single canvas duffel bag and walked out the front door, leaving me with a towering stack of overdue notices and a crying, confused child. Yet, as Harper grew older, she slowly twisted his memory into something tragically beautiful. To her, he is not a cowardly deadbeat who ran away from his responsibilities. He is a misunderstood artist, a tragic free spirit who just could not be caged by the mundane, soul-crushing demands of fatherhood. I was the boring one. I was the strict, exhausted woman who forced her to do math homework and eat cheap vegetables. He was the phantom hero who never had to say no. I take a slow sip of room-temperature tap water from the plain glass in front of me. I do not touch the vintage champagne circling the room on silver trays. I tell myself that this coldness from my own flesh and blood is acceptable. This profound isolation is merely the final receipt for a job well done. I successfully raised my daughter. I shielded her from the brutal, gnawing realities of poverty. I pushed her upward, launching her into the upper echelons of modern society. She is safe. She is financially secure. The heavy price for her glorious ascension is simply my own total invisibility. I tell myself, I can live with being a ghost. The contrast in the room is suffocating. At the center, Julian's family radiates a loud, unearned arrogance. They clink crystal glasses, they boast loudly about their recent venture capital acquisitions, and they aggressively pat each other on the back for being the new masters of the universe. At my corner table, the silence is thick and heavy. It presses down on my shoulders. The opulent chandeliers above seem to actively mock the cheap, fraying fabric of my hemline. Every loud burst of laughter from the head table is a sharp reminder of the vast chasm between us. They are the shining, untouchable stars of this new digital empire. I am just the dark, empty space that surrounds them. But they do not understand the dark. They do not realize that the shadows are exactly where the real, unshakable foundations are poured. For now, I remain seated. I smooth out the invisible wrinkles on my navy dress, fold my rough hands carefully in my lap, and wait for the speeches to begin. A silver spoon gently struck the side of a crystal champagne flute. The sharp, clear ring sliced through the low murmur of the ballroom, demanding immediate silence. The heavy mahogany doors at the back were closed, sealing us all inside for the evening's main event. It was time for the toasts. Julian's father stood up from the center of the head table. He was a man who moved as if he owned the very floorboards he walked on. He adjusted his silk tie and leaned into the microphone. For the next 15 minutes, his booming, overly confident voice echoed off the gilded ceiling. He spoke of legacy. He spoke of matching pedigrees and the bright, limitless future of the tech industry. But woven meticulously through his flowery praises was a distinct, undeniable thread of condescension. He smiled warmly at my daughter, declaring how proud their family was to take Harper under their wing. He phrased it beautifully, calling her a diamond in the rough that their family had graciously polished. He spoke of bringing her into their world, elevating her from her humble beginnings into a life of true consequence. Every syllable was a polite, heavily veiled reminder that she was a charity project they had successfully funded. Then it was Harper's turn. She stood up, swaying just a fraction of an inch. Her cheeks were flushed a deep pink from the vintage champagne and the intoxicating rush of being the absolute center of attention. She gripped the microphone stand with both hands. "I just want to say thank you," she began, her voice breathy and amplified. She turned toward Julian's parents, her eyes shining with unshed tears of adoration. "Thank you for welcoming me. I have spent my entire life searching for a place to belong. You have given me the real family I always dreamed of having." A collective, affectionate sigh rippled through the front tables. The silence at my table in the far corner remained suffocating. Harper paused, shifting her weight. Her gaze drifted slightly downward, taking on a practiced, melancholic softness. "Today I cannot help but think of my father. He passed away before he could see me standing here. He was a dreamer." She took a shallow breath, letting the drama of the moment settle over the hushed crowd. "My dad never had much, he just tried his best." I sat perfectly still. My hands remained folded in my lap. Harper then lifted her chin. Her eyes scanned the massive room, skipping over the important guests, until they finally landed on the dark, forgotten corner where I sat. A playful, slightly pitying smile touched the corners of her mouth. "And my mom," she continued, her tone instantly becoming lighter, entirely dismissive. "Well, my mom was always there, right behind everyone else. She was always trying to keep the lights on in the house with her meager salary. Thank you, Mom, for trying, even though we could never really go far." The delivery was entirely casual, tossed out like a discarded napkin. It was a joke played at the expense of a tired, irrelevant woman. The ballroom erupted. It was not a mean-spirited roar, which would have been easier to bear. It was a polite, unified ripple of sympathetic laughter. It was the sound of 300 wealthy strangers looking at a pathetic side character in the grand movie of Harper's life, and finding her delightfully tragic. I could feel their eyes briefly flicking toward my table, taking in my plain navy dress and my silent demeanor before immediately returning their focus to the glowing bride. At the head table, Julian's mother leaned back in her chair. She tilted her head toward my corner, her lips curving into a tight, victorious smirk. It was a look of pure, unadulterated supremacy. She had won the ultimate prize. She owned the loyalty of my daughter while I was reduced to a punchline about unpaid utility bills. Any normal mother might have broken down. They might have quietly pushed their chair back, rushed to the restroom, and wept silently into a rough paper towel. They might have grabbed their coat and fled into the warm Texas night. I did neither. I reached out with my right hand. I grasped the smooth, cold glass of tap water resting in front of me. I lifted it exactly 1 inch off the tablecloth. Then, with absolute deliberate precision, I placed it back down. The base of the glass met the table without a single tremor, without a microscopic splash. In that fraction of a second, the heavy, suffocating weight I had carried for over 2 decades completely vanished. A profound glacial clarity flooded my veins, cooling the air in my lungs. I had enabled this. By stepping into the shadows to protect her from the corrupting influence of unearned wealth, I had accidentally built a monster of entitlement. I had allowed her to worship a deadbeat phantom while she stepped on the very spine that kept her upright. I had let these arrogant, hollow people convince her that my silence was a symptom of defeat. I looked at Harper, who was now laughing and raising her glass to her new superior family. She looked so safe. She looked so incredibly secure in her newly inherited fortress of privilege. It was a beautiful fortress. It was time to burn it to the ground. I left the reception before they served the elaborate tiered cake. I did not say goodbye to the bride or the groom. I simply handed my paper ticket to a yawning valet attendant and slipped into the driver's seat of my rented sedan. As I accelerated onto the deserted Texas interstate, the suffocating, perfumed atmosphere of the ballroom was violently sucked out the window into the rushing night air. I gripped the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The tired, defeated posture I had carefully maintained for hours instantly evaporated. I rolled my shoulders back, feeling my spine perfectly align. I was no longer the pathetic punchline of a wedding toast. I am not a mid-level administrative assistant at Stratos Edge Dynamics. I never was. I am the sole architect, the anonymous founder, and the overwhelming majority shareholder of the entire global enterprise. For exactly 20 years, I have deliberately employed a continuous string of highly paid, charismatic figurehead chief executive officers. I paid them exorbitant salaries to stand in the blazing spotlight to absorb the relentless media attention and to flash their perfect teeth on the glossy covers of financial magazines. Meanwhile, I operated entirely from the deep shadows. I sat in a highly secured, unlisted office tower, pulling every single invisible string that transformed the company into an unstoppable multi-billion-dollar titan of industry. I chose this absolute, impenetrable anonymity for one specific reason. I desperately wanted Harper to have a completely normal, grounded childhood. I had witnessed firsthand what sudden massive wealth did to the children of my elite peers in the tech industry. It bred a toxic, lazy entitlement. It forged hollow, brittle human beings who truly believed the universe owed them absolute devotion simply for existing. I wanted my daughter to understand the brutal value of hard work. I wanted her to know what it meant to earn a bi-weekly paycheck and to build a life entirely on her own merit. I kept my immense fortune locked away in blind trusts and complex offshore accounts, feeding us only enough to live comfortably, but modestly, in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was a calculated, agonizingly disciplined sacrifice. Yet driving past the blurred streetlights of Austin, the bitter truth tasted like metallic ash in my mouth. My grand, decades-long social experiment had spectacularly backfired. By hiding the reality of my power, I had not protected her from elitism at all. I had simply pushed her to seek it out in the arms of people who actively despised women like the one I pretended to be. My protection had inadvertently created an ungrateful opportunist who worshipped the very superficial arrogance I had sacrificed everything to shield her from. The most agonizing, delicious irony of it all was Julian, the golden boy, the brilliant rising tech visionary. His entire family paraded his new startup LuminaCore as the absolute crown jewel of their modern legacy. They had strutted through that ballroom tonight drunk on the massive valuation of a company they firmly believed would change the digital landscape forever. What they did not know, what Julian was far too arrogant and inexperienced to look deeply into, was the foundational architecture of his own celebrated product. LuminaCore did not own its proprietary core system. They merely leased it. The entire operational functionality of Julian's revolutionary software, every single line of executing code that made his company viable to investors, ran exclusively on a master license issued by Stratos Edge Dynamics. It was a license granting temporary access to a heavily encrypted source code I wrote with my own two hands in a cramped, unheated apartment exactly 19 years ago. Julian was not a pioneer. He was a tenant living in a digital house I built, paying monthly rent to my invisible empire. I pulled into the underground concrete parking garage of my hotel. The digital dashboard clock glowed, reading exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. I turned off the engine but did not unlock the doors. Instead, I reached deep into my leather purse, completely bypassing my standard personal phone. I pulled out a sleek, heavily encrypted device I utilized strictly for secure board-level communications. I dialed a private, unlisted number I knew by heart. It rang only twice. "Fox!" A sharp, perfectly awake female voice answered. It was Elena, my chief corporate counsel. She was a woman famously feared throughout the financial sector for possessing the legal aggression of a starving shark. "It is 2 a.m. in Texas. Tell me we are initiating a hostile corporate takeover." "Something much more precise, Elena," I replied, my voice cold and echoing slightly in the silent confines of the vehicle. "I need you to pull the master licensing agreement for a startup called LuminaCore, Julian's company." I immediately heard the rapid, aggressive clicking of a mechanical keyboard on her end of the line. "Pulling the files now. They are currently gearing up for a massive Series C funding round. The venture capital market is very hot on them right now. What exactly are we looking for?" "Everything." I stated, my tone devoid of any emotion. "Comb through every single clause, every minor technicality, every buried legal provision. I want to know exactly how much leverage we hold over their core infrastructure. Find the legal loophole that allows us to completely squeeze the life out of their operational capacity." "You want to legally assassinate your new son-in-law's company on the night of his wedding?" Elena asked, a distinct hint of dark, predatory amusement lacing her tone. "No," I corrected her firmly, staring blankly at the concrete wall ahead. "I do not want to destroy my daughter. I want to completely dismantle the warped, arrogant belief system she and her new family worship. I want to strip away their unearned pride." "Understood completely," Elena said, the sound of her typing intensifying. "I will have a lethal strategy on your desk by dawn." I disconnected the call. The silence inside the car was absolute. I stepped out into the dimly lit, freezing garage. The heavy burden of playing the meek, struggling mother was finally gone. The air felt incredibly light and the path forward was violently clear. The shadow was finally moving. Exactly 3 weeks after the wedding, the Golden Boy was flying dangerously close to the scorching sun. LuminaCore was the absolute darling of the Silicon Valley financial press. They were in the final triumphant stages of securing a massive Series C funding round. The target capital was $100 million. The valuation would push Julian and his family into the billionaire stratosphere. They were busy popping imported champagne in their open-plan, glass-walled offices, giving smug interviews to tech blogs, and celebrating a future built entirely on stolen momentum. Then the invisible guillotine dropped. It happened on a perfectly crisp Tuesday morning. At exactly 9 o'clock, a bonded courier walked into the gleaming, minimalist lobby of LuminaCore in San Francisco. He bypassed the smiling receptionist and handed a heavily sealed certified legal document directly to Julian's lead corporate attorney. The letter was a masterpiece drafted by Elena. It was cold, brutally efficient, and utterly devoid of mercy. Stratos Edge Dynamics formally declined to renew the perpetual licensing agreement for the foundational core source code. The legally bulletproof reason cited was a mandatory, non-negotiable strategic cybersecurity restructuring. The grace period before a total server blackout was exactly 30 days. The fallout was instantaneous and utterly catastrophic. When Julian read the document, the blood drained entirely from his face. He understood the mathematics of his own doom. Without that specific license, Luminacore was not a revolutionary tech company. It was just a beautifully decorated office space filled with overpaid executives, ping-pong tables, and useless marketing brochures. The core product, the very heart of the software that the investors were about to buy, would simply cease to exist. The encryption on my original code was unbreakable. There was no temporary workaround. There was no backup plan. Panic, raw and unfiltered, flooded their pristine empire. Julian immediately tried to leverage his family's highly touted connections. He made frantic phone calls to industry insiders. He tried to bypass the standard corporate channels and reach an executive vice president at Stratos Edge Dynamics. He hit a solid, impenetrable wall of corporate silence. Stratos was a fortified citadel, and I had personally ordered the drawbridge raised. No one answered his calls. No one replied to his urgent, increasingly desperate emails. The crisis could not be contained. The venture capitalists caught wind of the catastrophic vulnerability within 48 hours. The investors, who were perfectly ready to write checks for $100 million, suddenly froze all escrow accounts. The Golden Empire was rapidly disintegrating into worthless dust. Julian's father, the man who had boasted so loudly at the wedding reception about elevating my daughter, was reportedly screaming at junior partners in a blind panic. The arrogant sneers they wore while mocking a quiet mother in a cheap navy dress were entirely gone. They were suffocating, frantically gasping for the financial oxygen I had just cleanly cut off. It took them exactly 5 days of absolute misery before their towering pride completely broke. My phone rang late on a Sunday evening. I was sitting comfortably in the expansive mahogany-lined library of my actual estate, holding a warm cup of imported chamomile tea. The caller ID displayed Harper's name. I let the device vibrate against the oak table 3 times before I casually swiped the screen to answer. The polished, superior tone my daughter had wielded from the wedding stage was entirely gone. She was hyperventilating. She was sobbing uncontrollably, the sound raw, ugly, and desperate. "Mom, you have to help us. Please, you have to help Julian. They're going to lose everything." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. "Breathe, Harper. What exactly is the problem?" "It is Julian's company," she cried, her voice cracking with pure terror. "Stratos Edge Dynamics is pulling their core license. The investors are threatening to walk away. The whole business will go bankrupt in less than 30 days. Mom, you work at Stratos, right? You have been there forever. You must know someone in the legal department or an administrator or anyone who can push a file through. Can you please submit a plea? Just beg them for an extension. Julian's father is having chest pains. We are utterly terrified." I listened to the frantic gasps of the young woman who had publicly reduced my entire existence to a pathetic joke about unpaid utility bills just 21 days ago. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no parental urge to soothe her distress. I only felt the cold, hard satisfaction of a steel trap snapping tightly shut around its prey. "I will see what I can do," I replied. My voice was utterly flat, betraying no emotion, no anxiety, and no maternal warmth. "Do not panic. Tell Julian to book a flight for his entire family. Come to the global headquarters in Seattle on Monday morning. Arrive at exactly 9 o'clock. I will arrange for you to meet the person who holds the absolute decision-making power." Harper let out a loud, shuddering gasp of immense relief. "Oh my God, thank you. Thank you so much, Mom. I knew you would try. I know it is a massive favor to ask your bosses, but we owe you our lives. I will tell Julian right now." She disconnected the call, completely convinced that her invisible, unremarkable mother was about to risk her tiny administrative job to beg an anonymous executive for a scrap of corporate mercy. She felt a surge of hope, completely oblivious to the fact that she was flying directly into the eye of a Category 5 hurricane. She had absolutely no idea that the executioner she was traveling to meet was the very same woman she had just thanked for trying. Monday morning in Seattle was a relentless freezing downpour, a perfectly fitting atmosphere for a corporate execution. The Stratos Edge Dynamics global headquarters towered over the city center, a brutalist monument of black steel and highly reflective reinforced glass that pierced the heavy gray clouds. Harper Julian and his parents walked through the towering revolving doors into the cavernous, pristine lobby. Even in their state of absolute panic and desperation, I could easily spot the lingering traces of their inherent condescension. They smoothed the lapels of their expensive designer coats, looking around the bustling ground floor with a chaotic mix of frantic need and subtle disdain. They were entering my supposed workplace, expecting to be met by a nervous low-level receptionist or to find me scurrying out from a cramped cubicle with a printed visitor badge in my hand. Harper kept checking her mobile phone, shifting her weight impatiently, likely annoyed that I was not waiting by the metal detectors to guide them through the plebeian ranks of ordinary workers. They were intercepted instead by two massive men in immaculate charcoal suits bearing discreet earpieces. Without offering a single word of polite greeting, the security agents ushered the confused family past the standard employee checkpoints, entirely bypassing the hundreds of normal staff members swiping their plastic access cards. They were guided swiftly to a private, unmarked elevator bay, hidden behind a thick, frosted glass partition. One of the security agents pressed his thumb against a glowing biometric scanner. The heavy steel doors glided open without a sound. As the elevator shot upward, the immense, unyielding speed caused their ears to pop. The digital display did not stop at the administrative levels. It kept climbing, flashing rapidly past the 50th, the 70th, the 90th floors. Julian began to sweat profusely. The ambient temperature in the cabin was perfectly regulated, yet a cold, greasy perspiration broke out across his forehead. He aggressively tugged at the tight knot of his silk tie. The terrifying reality of cognitive dissonance was finally beginning to take root in his mind. His analytical brain was desperately trying to calculate how a low-level clerical worker could possibly grant them immediate access to the absolute highest security tier of a multi-billion-dollar corporate fortress. The elevator finally chimed and slowed to a smooth halt at the 99th floor, the top floor, the absolute peak of the empire. The doors parted, revealing an expansive boardroom that looked more like the fortified command center of a sovereign nation than a standard meeting space. The walls were paneled in dark acoustic mahogany, and a massive floor-to-ceiling window offered a dizzying, rain-swept view of the entire city below. A gigantic slab of polished black marble served as the central conference table. Standing near the head of the table was Elena, holding a sleek leather folder against her chest. She did not offer them a seat. She did not offer them coffee. She simply stared at them with the cold, detached curiosity of a scientist observing trapped insects. At the very center of the table, facing the violent storm outside, sat a high-backed leather executive chair. "You are exactly on time," Elena stated, her voice slicing cleanly through the heavy, terrified silence of the room. "The decision-maker will see you now." The large leather chair slowly rotated. I did not move quickly. I let the dramatic tension stretch to its absolute breaking point, forcing them to hold their breath before I finally faced them. I was not wearing a cheap, fraying navy dress with hand-stitched alterations. I was dressed in a razor-sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit imported directly from Milan. My posture was rigid, perfectly aligned, exuding an absolute terrifying authority. I rested my elbows on the cold marble, steepling my fingers together. I did not smile. I did not blink. I simply watched them burn. Elena stepped forward, her sharp heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floor. "Allow me to formally introduce you. This is Mrs. Kennedy Fox. She is the founder, the chairman of the board, and the sole controlling owner of Stratos Edge Dynamics." The psychological impact in the room was completely devastating. It was as if a massive vacuum had instantly sucked all the oxygen out of the atmosphere. Julian's father, the arrogant man who had loudly bragged about elevating my daughter out of poverty at the wedding, physically stumbled backward. His jaw dropped open in a grotesque, paralyzed shock, his face draining of all its wealthy color. Julian's mother, The woman who had smirked at my supposed financial struggles just weeks ago clutched her expensive handbag so tightly her knuckles turned entirely white. She looked as though she was about to vomit right on the polished floor. But it was Harper who truly shattered. She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish pulled from the ocean. Her brain was violently short-circuiting. The fundamental reality she had built her entire identity upon was collapsing in real time. She simply could not process the impossible truth standing before her. The tired, invisible woman she had mocked from a brightly lit stage was currently holding the absolute power of life and death over her entire new world. I did not give them a single moment to recover from the trauma. I picked up a thick, heavy dossier from the table and threw it effortlessly across the slick marble surface. It slid rapidly and stopped precisely in front of Julian's trembling hands. "Open it," I commanded. My voice was no longer the soft, agreeable tone of a compromising, exhausted mother. It was the sharp, metallic bark of a corporate apex predator. Julian's hands shook violently as he opened the folder. He stared down at pages of densely printed architectural schematics and deeply nested server logs. "Let us dispense with the pathetic illusion that you are a technological visionary." I stated, my words hitting him like physical blows to the chest. "Your entire LuminaCore platform is nothing but a fragile user interface wrapped entirely around my proprietary kernel. You did not innovate a single thing. Your encryption protocols, they are legacy subroutines I wrote 12 years ago in a dark room. Your data processing algorithms, they operate exclusively through restricted application programming interfaces that I own, I host, and I monitor. You built a beautifully painted wooden shack directly on top of my reinforced concrete foundation, and you actually had the sheer arrogance to call yourself a master architect." Julian could not look up. His eyes were glued to the undeniable, legally binding proof of his own intellectual mediocrity. "You went to the financial press," I continued, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register that echoed in the silent room. "You told the eager investors you had a revolutionary product worth $100 million. But the objective truth, Julian, is that you are nothing but a parasite. You are a digital tenant who forgot to pay respect to the landlord who owns the ground you walk on. You thought my silence was weakness. You thought my modesty was stupidity. You were entirely wrong." Julian looked up from the devastating dossier, his face pale and completely broken. Desperation violently clawed at his throat. He reached his trembling hands across the cold marble table, palms upturned in a pathetic display of submission. "Mom, please," Julian begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, frantic whine. "We are a family. We are all on the same side here." I did not even blink. I leaned forward, my gaze slicing through his fragile ego like a freshly honed razor. At the wedding, I was an outsider. I stated, my voice echoing off the acoustic mahogany walls with absolute finality. I was a punchline sitting at the back table. Here in this room, I am the chairman. You will address me as Mrs. Fox. Julian snapped his mouth shut, swallowing hard. The older generation, his overly proud and wealthy parents, stood entirely paralyzed behind him. They were completely stripped of their arrogant armor, realizing they were nothing but hostages inside my boardroom. I turned my attention away from the ruined golden boy and looked directly at my daughter. Harper was trembling violently. Tears were streaming heavily down her face, ruining her perfect, expensive makeup. The veil of delusion had finally been ripped from her eyes. "You were entirely right during your speech," I told her, keeping my tone perfectly level, devoid of any cruelty, but packed with undeniable, terrifying authority. "Your father never had much money. He was a man who just tried his best, and he failed. But you fundamentally misunderstood my place in your life. I do not try, Harper. I succeed." I gestured slightly to Elena. She stepped forward with the precise grace of an executioner placing a single freshly printed legal document exactly in the center of the black marble table. She laid a heavy gold fountain pen right next to it. I did not intend to destroy the company. Complete annihilation was a blunt, unimaginative instrument, and I strongly preferred surgical precision. "That is a new legally binding licensing agreement," I announced, watching Julian's eyes dart frantically toward the crisp white paper. It guarantees perpetual unrestricted access to the core source code. I will not unplug Lumina Core. I will allow your venture capital funding to proceed without interference. However, there is exactly one non-negotiable condition in exchange for my signature. The entire room held its collective breath. Julian, I continued, locking my cold eyes with his terrified ones. You will immediately transfer exactly 40% of your total equity in Lumina Core into a newly formed independent financial trust. This trust will be held exclusively in Harper's name. She will have absolute uncontested voting control over those shares. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. I had just single-handedly rewritten the entire power dynamic of their precious celebrated dynasty. Harper was no longer the poor, unfortunate girl they had graciously elevated from poverty. I was handing her the ultimate, unbreakable leverage. With 40% voting power and the absolute backing of my technological infrastructure, her new in-laws could never patronize her, dismiss her, or disrespect her again. I had violently stripped the power directly from their hands and forged it into an indestructible crown for my daughter. Harper stared at me. She let out a loud, breathless sob. It was not a cry of humiliation or fear. It was the overwhelming sound of absolute understanding. In that singular, crystal-clear moment, she finally comprehended the colossal magnitude of my lifelong sacrifice and the ruthless, terrifying depth of my protective love. I had let her resent me. I had let her ignore me, all so I could silently build the very weapon that would make her completely untouchable. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my charcoal suit. I did not need a tearful, dramatic reconciliation. I did not require her to stand on a brightly lit stage and sing my praises to a room full of wealthy strangers. I already possessed everything I wanted. You have exactly 1 hour to sign the document, I said, turning away from the marble table. Elena will oversee the legal transfer. I walked confidently toward the heavy boardroom doors. From this day forward, whenever Julian or his arrogant family took a deep breath of success, they would intimately know exactly who owned their oxygen. My silence was no longer the quiet submission of an invisible mother. It was the absolute commanding silence of a king. Thank you so sincerely to everyone for listening to today's story. We deeply appreciate your time and would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from, so please let us know in the comments. If you found today's story engaging and powerful, please consider supporting our channel with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen, or by using the PayPal link provided in the description and the comments section of this video. Your generous support allows us to pay our dedicated team, helping them feed their families and continue creating even better stories for you to enjoy. Thank you once again, and we look forward to bringing you our next tale.